Hi, everyone. Okay, a lot to talk about this week. We're doing all of book 4 in one go here. Normally, I break this down into two, but because the nature of this class, where we're meeting only more or less meeting once a week, um, I'm going to go ahead and combine the two lectures into one. So, okay, so book 4, Hume starts to drift away. So far in the text, he's been talking about um, mainly what I like to call like the mental architecture or the mental framework um, of the person. So he's been looking at the different parts of the mind. What are the things that if you look around in the mind that you will find? You're going to find impressions, ideas. You're going to find certain powers. These sorts of things. These are all just kind of parts of the furniture and the architecture of the mind. Starting in book 4, he's going to start focusing on the sorts of things that we do with the mind. Namely, forming beliefs, right? So lots of times when we form a belief, we do it as an act of the will or an act of, an intention or something like that. Not always. All sorts of beliefs we don't form that way. Um, I would venture to guess that you believe that you're listening to a lecture right now. You believe that you're sitting in front of a computer right now, but that you're not, as it were, forming that belief by an act of the will. Rather, you just sort of form that belief because you've got these experiences in front of you and you're not making really any inference. You're just, there's a computer in front of me. Right? So not all beliefs are formed that way. But lots of beliefs are. You choose to accept a proposition. You choose to trust somebody, right? Something like that. So lots of beliefs we do have control over. So Hume is just sort of changing his focus away from as it were, the pure architecture of the mind, just the furniture, and then now he's starting to go into beliefs, and particularly he's going to try to talk about the different sorts of beliefs and whether and to what extent we can be rationally justified in accepting them. Okay. So he breaks beliefs down into two primary species. Excuse me. What he calls relations of ideas and matters of fact. Now, relations of ideas for Hume are exactly what it sounds like. It's a way of taking the ideas in the mind and relating them in certain ways and being able to, based off of that relation alone, determine whether any proposition that you draw from those relations are true or false, right? So basically what Hume's got in mind here is relations of ideas are beliefs of a mathematical or logical sort. Because the basic idea is take 2 plus 2 is 4. Well, you've got the idea of 2 and plus and equals and 4 already in your mind. You can just relate them in a certain way. What if I take a 2 and I add a 2 to it, now I'm going to claim that when I take a 2 and a 2 and I add them together, they're going to equal 4. You're just relating those ideas in a way, and then Hume says that you can relate the ideas, and then you can make a judgment. Is this a true proposition or a false proposition? 2 plus 2 being 4, obviously, is a true proposition, right? So for him, all relations of ideas are going to fundamentally be either true or false by definition. So he thinks all mathematical and logical truths, which, again, relations of ideas are fundamentally going to be truths of a mathematical or logical sort. He thinks that fundamentally they are all just going to basically be true by definition. So remember, something that's true by definition is something like all bachelors are unmarried males, all triangles are three-sided objects whose inner angles sum to 180 degrees on a Euclidean plane, stuff like that, right? Now, it might seem kind of strange to suggest that mathematical truths are true by definition. And actually, we're going to see this is a primary disagreement between Kant and Hume. Kant is going to disagree with Hume that mathematical truths are true by definition. But I think what Hume's got in mind here is, look, so if I say all bachelors are unmarried males, right, that's true by definition. Well, look at the structure of that proposition, right? I've got this verb to be, right? In this case, it's the plural version, are, but sometimes you have is as well. So I've got basically a proposition that say X is Y, or all X are Y, or something like that. All bachelors are unmarried males, right? And you can, one of the ways you can use this verb to be, is or are, is by just sort of saying, look, is everything that's on the left-hand side of the word is the same as everything on the right-hand side, right? So on the one hand, we've got bachelor, on the other hand, unmarried male, and the question is, are they the same thing? If they are, then we can say that this is a true proposition. If they're not, it's a false proposition. Right? Clearly, to say all bachelors are unmarried males is a true proposition, because it turns out bachelor and unmarried male are just two different ways of saying the same thing. Right? Well, take something like 2 plus 2 equals 4. Right? You've got 2 and 2 on one side of the is, equals, right, is another way of saying is, right? Because you could just say 2 and 2 are 4, right? There's no reason to keep us from doing math that way, except for it's clunkier, right? If you read medieval mathematics, that's how they would have said it. Duo et duo sunt quatuor, right? Which literally is 2 and 2 are 4. They didn't have the system of notation that we have today. So for Hume, I mean, what he's got in mind here is that you've got basically an identity statement, 2 and 2 on one side of the word is, and 4 on the other, and you can just analyze, is it true? Do 2 and 2 and 4 equal the same thing? Are they, just like saying, does bachelor and unmarried male mean the same thing? Right? The answer is of course. So Hume basically thinks that all logic and all mathematics, even the really complicated stuff, can be broken down fundamentally into truths, propositions that can be analyzed as either true or false by definition. Right? The fancy word for this is tautology. Right? Fundamentally, all relations of ideas are tautologically true or tautologically false, which just means they're true or false by definition. They can also be known deductively, which is to say that you can prove relations of ideas. Should be kind of obvious, right? If something is true by definition, pretty easy actually to establish that fact, to prove it, right? But the idea here is this, that deduction is a type of argument whereby if it's done well, so first the primary purpose of a deduction is to establish the claim, that is to prove the conclusion. Right, to prove it, meaning that if you do a deduction well, denying the conclusion is tantamount to a logical contradiction. Either you've misunderstood something, you don't know what you're saying, or you're nuts. Those are kind of your three options, right? Good deductive arguments are such that everybody accepts the premises as true, and by doing so, they have to accept the conclusion as true. And failing to do that means they've either misunderstood one of the premises, they're somehow confused about what's going on, or they're insane. They're committing themselves to a logical contradiction, right? Or maybe not insane, but irrational or something like that, right? Their faculty of reason's broken, right? So deductive proofs are very strong. Right? They're like the gold standard in philosophy. If you can give a deductive proof, a good deductive proof for a position you're seeking to establish, like, pretty unassailable. You're in a good position. For Hume, all relations of ideas are like that, and you basically should be able to see why, right? Because if all relations of ideas are fundamentally going to fall back upon tautologies, truths by definition, then pretty easy to prove them, right? To establish, to claim, for instance, that someone is a bachelor but he's married is just a logical contradiction, right? How would you, clearly you either, okay, bachelor is kind of a big word, I guess, what the heck it means, or you're genuinely, like, your mind is broken, right? Like you're on the one hand, you're like, no, I understand that the definition of a bachelor is an unmarried male. I'm just telling you this guy is both a bachelor and married, right? What you're saying is this guy is both is an unmarried and a married male, which is just a direct it's just a contradiction. So it's betraying a problem with either your ability to understand what you're saying or your ability to reason. Right? So these are the gold standard if you can get them. Okay. That's relations of ideas. Now, matters of fact are basically all the sorts of other arguments, or all the sorts of other beliefs that are not mathematical or logical in nature. They have to do with the mind-independent world, with causation, that sort of stuff. Now, Hume thinks that matters of fact cannot be deduced. That is to say, that you can't use deductive reasoning to prove claims about matters of fact, to prove if someone challenges a belief about a matter of fact that you have, you can't use deduction to prove that belief. What you're left with is induction, right? Which is another type of logical argument. In induction, rather than using premises that try to prove really hard, like that is to say, really strongly establish on pain of contradiction, the conclusion, rather induction just seeks to strongly justify a conclusion. So in a really good induction, there's all the reason in the world to believe the conclusion, but you can still deny it without committing a contradiction. You might not want to deny it. It might be a really bad idea. All the evidence might suggest that you should accept the conclusion. So in induction, it's not to say that you can have really good induction arguments and just sort of ignore the conclusion. Like, yeah, I'm just going to deny it anyway. Like, that's not what we're saying. Rather, it's just that even in the strongest inductive cases, however much the premises obviously and painfully and clearly infer the conclusion, you can deny the conclusion without committing a logical contradiction, right? Okay. And so Hume's going to suggest that all beliefs and matters of fact are like that, right? There, no matter how much reason, sometimes very good reasons we have to accept a belief in a matter of fact, we can never justify that claim or that belief so much as to such a degree that denying it would be a logical contradiction, basically. Okay. Some of that just should be kind of obvious because that's just the I mean, it's true. Okay, it's kind of true by definition, right? I mean, if it is the case, in fact, that matters of fact are learned through induction or justified by induction, then it just turns out you can never prove them, because if you could, then you would be using deduction instead of induction, right? So that's just sort of true by definition in a way, right? That because Hume sets this up this way, that we only come to learn things about matters of fact through induction, that we can never prove them. Well, that just has to be the case if it's true that matters of fact are only justified by us through induction. Okay. So now Hume wants to raise a question. How can we justify induction? So this is where we're going to get this problem of induction that you've already spent some time on, right? And the basic problem is this. Look, we all understand what induction is, and we've all used it. Hume wants to know, why is it that we believe that induction works, right? Because there's nothing, it's not like it logically should have to work. Unlike with deduction, Hume seems to think, look, it has to work because fundamentally it's coming back to all deduction is going to be, in its most basic form, something like an identity statement, something like x equals x, which is just such a, or the law of non-contradiction. And these are such firm and established principles that they're almost self-justified, right? They're self-evidently true or something like that. But induction's not necessarily that way, right? So why is it, Hume just wants to ask, why is it that we should expect that inductive inferences will actually justify claims that we use induction to justify, right? And notice what Hume's response, or what Hume, or not what Hume. Notice how someone would respond with that. They would basically say, "Well, let's give an example. Let's give an example." So, what would be an inductive inference? The one that Hume uses is that the sun's going to rise tomorrow. Pretty safe bet, guys. Right? I'm telling you right now. Like, if you're going to put money down on it, on the question, is the sun going to rise tomorrow? You should affirm that, right? Yes, absolutely, 100%, right? Now, why do you believe that? Generally, why do you believe that? Because it's always risen in the morning? Like, why? Right? I mean, I guess some of us might actually know a little bit more about the nature of the solar system and all this sort of stuff. But look, the vast majority of us, we've just kind of experienced it that way, right? And so we bank on the fact, very importantly, bank on the fact that the sun will in fact rise tomorrow because it has always risen in the past, right? Now we know actually someday that's not going to be true. We've got some time. We've got like 5 billion years. So like we've got time. Your kids got time. Your grandkids got time, right? But one day, in fact, the sun won't rise tomorrow. In about 5 billion years or so, it's going to consume us all in a fiery holocaust. So we know, in fact, that someday, despite the fact that the sun has always risen every day, as reliably as anything that we have, anything that we know about, nonetheless, one day in the future, it won't actually do that thing anymore. Right? So that's sort of a typical inductive inference. How do I know the sun's? Why is it that I believe the sun's going to rise tomorrow? Because it always has. Right. Another inductive inference. How do I know? Why is it that I believe, or how do I justify the belief that when I get in my car this morning to drive to church, that when I put the key in the ignition and turn the key, the car's going to start, right? And my answer is because it basically always happened. I pretty good reason to believe that the car is in decent shape. There's no reason for it not to happen, I guess, and it's always happened when it's in decent shape, and there's no real reason for it not to happen. Therefore, I believe it's going to happen that way again this morning, right? So it's another inductive inference. Now, Hume just wants us to ask, okay, so one of the things that we're doing with induction is we're taking past examples, past experiences, and we're inferring that the future, things in the future will basically act in the same sort of way as they have always in the past. And there's my daughter. Hi, Eleanor. Sorry about that. I should have locked that door. Okay. So basically what Hume wants to ask us is, why is it that we think through induction that the future is always going to resemble the past in the same way that basically we think? Why is it that I believe that in the future, namely tomorrow, the sun will rise? Because it's always risen, guys. Wow. My daughter jarred me. Because it's always risen in the past, right? Okay. Now Hume points out, how do we justify this belief? So I'm a skeptical person. I ask you, why do you believe the sun's going to rise tomorrow? And you go, because it's always risen in the past. And then I just say, yeah, okay, but what is the past? Look, that's an interesting bit of information that it's always done that. But why should I believe that that's related to future events? Certainly, I can imagine that there is no relation between those two. Like I said, in fact, I know that someday the fact that the sun has always risen in the past is going to have no bearing whatever on what the sun's going to do tomorrow. Because, again, about 5 billion years, we know that the sun is going to consume us all. I don't know if it's actually going to make it out to Earth orbit. It might just like destroy our atmosphere. It might not actually consume us. You don't want to be here when it happens. That's the point, right? Okay. So if I wanted to be really skeptical about it, I could say, like, okay, that's interesting. Like, things have always happened in the past in this way. But what bearing does that have in the future? I know that someday my car is not going to start, right? That's generally when people get new cars, is at some point they're just like, you turn the key and it's like, well, we had a good run, old friend, right? And at that point, when you turn the key and the car's just not going to start, it's like irrelevant that it's always started in the past. It's like that's not reason anymore to accept that to be completely shocked by this fact, like, well, I don't understand why the car's not running. It's always started in the past, right? You just kind of realize, well, at some point the cars die, right? The fact that this one's never died before is kind of irrelevant, right? Okay, so if I wanted to be really skeptical, I would ask that question. Well, look, what does the past have to do with the future? Why do you feel justified in making an inference from the past to the future? Okay, and Hume thinks there's really only one way of justifying it. How would you respond? You would say, you would start pointing to other instances where the past has been like the future. In other words, so I would say, so why is it that the past should influence our beliefs about the future? And you might say, well, look, I'm going to take this marker and I'm going to throw it up and it falls down. I'll do it again. Do it again. Now, do I think if I throw this marker up, it'll fall? Yes. Why do I think that? Because it's always done so, right? So what Hume thinks is, if we want to answer the question, how do you justify this inductive inference? Most people are going to use an induction. They're going to say, well, because it's always worked before. Why do I believe that the past resembles the future? Or rather, I suppose you would want to say that the future resembles the past in a meaningful way. Because in the past, they've always resembled each other in a meaningful way. I have no reason to think that that's going to change now, right? It's just the way things work, basically, would be how we would respond. So what Hume wants to point out is we've got an interesting problem here. It seems that we're question begging, right? The question on the table is, how do we justify inductive inferences? And the answer to that question seems to be by using an inductive inference, right? And so Hume points out, okay, say what you will, then it might be very much the case that this is something about human psychology, that we just tend to notice these things that happen for seemingly in law-like ways or something. Whenever something happens often enough in the past, we make an inference that it's going to happen into the future. Okay, that's interesting, but it might be an interesting and very useful fact about human psychology. But when you're actually asked to justify why it is that we think this relationship exists, we can't do it logically. Why not? Because the only logic we can use in justifying induction is induction itself, which is patently question begging, right? I mean, it's patently, so question begging is a type of inference. It's sometimes a fallacy, sometimes not. We're not going to get into that. Certain types of question begging that are not fallacious at all. But in this case, there does seem to be a fallacious circularity here, because the question is, how do I know induction is trustworthy? And the answer is, because induction is trustworthy. Yikes, right? That's not really an answer to the question. You're just kind of saying, well, induction is trustworthy because it's trustworthy. Oh, well, how do you know it's trustworthy? Because it's trustworthy. Okay, right. So see, like, that's not really answering the question. That's like if somebody says, why do you believe in God? And they say, well, because the Bible tells me he exists. And then someone says, yeah, but why should I care about the Bible? And the person says, because it's the Word of God. Well, oh, okay. So in order for the Bible to be authoritative, God must already exist. But if I ask you, how did you know that God exists? You're going to use the Bible, whose authority presupposes God's existence already. So that's sort of a circular argument, right? At the end of the day, you're saying, how do you know that God exists? And your answer is basically because a text whose authority depends upon the existence of God tells me that God exists, right? That answer already presupposes God's existence, right? So it's sort of a circular problem, right? At the end of the day, in other words, it doesn't justify the answer to the question, right? You're just sort of presupposing a justification without actually offering one. Something like that is what Hume is worried about, okay, with induction. It seems that rather than actually justifying induction, we're presupposing that induction is already justified. Right? And that seems to be a logical problem. It is straightforwardly a logical problem. Okay, so that's the problem of induction. Why does he raise that? So far, it seems like kind of a maybe an interesting discovery of logic. You know what I mean? Like, I don't even think it's particularly novel to Hume. I'm not sure, actually, whether he first develops this problem. I can't imagine that he's the first one who's developed it. But anyway, you might so far just think, okay, well, that's kind of an interesting bit of logic. Right? So it turns out maybe induction, there's a problem with its own justification. Right? Okay. But then Hume goes on, well, here's something else that's very interesting that I think I've learned. So we've got a problem of induction. Well, now let's take cause and effect. Okay, so we all believe that there are all sorts of events that where A occurs, B follows after, right? And we trust that B will follow so regularly that we will actually start to anticipate, oh, there's A, I need to expect B, right? Sometimes it's pretty prosaic or mundane, tossing up a marker and having it fall down. We believe that the marker, lovely. My athletic skills on display, folks. We believe that the marker goes up because I've tossed it up, and we believe it's going to come down because of gravity. So that's sort of two levels of causation. Of course, all of our lives, the most important things of our lives, are based upon causal beliefs. We eat food because we believe that there's a causal relationship between staying alive and eating. We drink water and not methane because we believe there's a causal relation between water sustaining us and methane killing us. I hear my baby son crying, or my daughter Eleanor, who's 4, crying. I believe there's a causal relation between their sobs and like what I'm hearing of like the stuff actually entering my ear and them actually producing the sound with their mouth, stuff like that. So really important things that we believe based off of cause and effect. Now Hume wants to ask us, how is it that we justify this belief? Just sort of like with induction, right? Where is it that belief in causal relations or cause and effect comes from? So Hume asks us to consider 2 billiard balls, right? So normally when in a classroom setting, this is where I kick a chair. I kick it several times. 1, because I'm real angsty. I just like to get my aggression out. But 2, because even the most disengaged student kind of gets popped into like paying attention once I kick a chair over 3 or 4 times. I'm not going to kick a chair. Not a lot of room in this little office, and I'm not even sure how I'd set the camera up in the right way anyway. But the idea is this. Imagine I'm kicking a chair, like so. I kind of, or I say, just punch a chair. Like I punch it, and then like the chair flies over. Right? We do it again. Like boom, boom. Right? Now we can even slow it down, like right, something like that. Now Hume is going to ask you, what did you see? Most people will say, if they haven't been corrupted by philosophy yet, they'll say something like, I saw a person kick a chair over, right? And you sort of slow it down. It's like what you saw was like a fist, like a foot go into a chair. So boom, and then the chair flying over, or something like that, right? What Hume's going to say is, okay, so let's break this down. You've got foot hitting chair, chair flying over. So we've seen foot hitting chair, chair flying over. Where did you see cause? Where did you see chair or foot causing chair to fall over? Right? Hume thinks unless you're using see, the verb to see, in a really metaphorical sense, in an incredibly abstract sense, you didn't really see the foot cause the chair to go over. What you saw was the foot kick the chair, that is, the foot physically run into the chair, and then the chair move and fall over, right? But there's no cause there, right? At least there's nothing there to be seen. What does cause look like? What does it smell like, taste like, feel like, sound like, right? I mean, where's cause? Do you guys see cause in the room? Look around your rooms. Do you see cause anywhere, right? Hume's going to suggest, no, of course you don't see it anywhere in the event. You don't hear it anywhere in the event. Smell it, taste it, touch it, any of that sort of stuff, right? What you see is a foot hitting a chair and a chair falling over. That's what you see. That's what the senses relate to us. So then where does this belief come from? Why is it that we believe that there's a causal relationship there? Well, Hume's going to offer 2 possible candidates. The first one he's going to reject. He's going to say, well, maybe what we're doing is using like a logical inference, like induction, right? We're saying, well, look, every time I've seen a foot hit a chair, it falls over in normal circumstances, provided that the chair isn't bolted to the ground, or or maybe a super heavy chair or something like that. So maybe if I wanted to justify this belief, I would use an induction, right? I would say every time someone's kicked a chair, generally it falls over, right? Well, we've already learned that that's problematic, right? You can't justify anything with induction because induction itself is unjustifiable. It seems that it itself is an unjustified kind of inference. So because it rests on a question-begging defense. So if induction itself is unjustifiable, then all inductions are unjustifiable. And so we can't justify our belief in causal relations by recourse to an inductive inference, right? But frankly, more to the point, now Hume doesn't really actually come out and say this, but I think more to the point, most people, when they see someone kick something and it fly, they don't think, this is like one of those cases where every time someone kicks something, it goes flying. So this must be like all those other cases, so I'm going to believe that he caused the thing. Right? I mean, again, Hume doesn't say this, but I think it's kind of obvious that that's just generally not the way we work in the world. I see someone kick a chair, and I just think immediately he caused it to go flying. So all this induction stuff is, as it were, kind of unnatural. It would only come up in a really sort of inorganic way, like if you had a skeptical philosopher asking you to justify your belief, something like that. But generally, people just see stuff and they accept it, right? Again, you just kind of believe you're hearing me talk to you in a lecture right now. You just kind of believe you're sitting in front of a computer. You're not actually making an induction, like, well, it seems as though I'm sitting before a computer. And in the past, every time I've found myself in a position where it seemed like I was sitting in a computer, I actually was, in fact, sitting in front of a computer. Therefore, I will conclude that I must be sitting in front of a computer. Right? It's like a super inorganic way of living life. Most of us don't do that at all. We just sort of accept it. Right? So I think Hume's really onto something here, not just because of the problem of induction, but more generally, so whatever, like, let's just ignore the problem of induction for a moment. Like, that's just not the way we tend to think about things, right? So it's an interesting question. On the one hand, if we wanted to go to induction, it's inert, right? It's impotent. It can't help us in this way because it can't justify anything because it rests on question-begging premises or question-begging grounds. But more to the point, if we tried to justify it using induction, it just seems to be not the way we generally accept beliefs in this about certain things like causal relations anyway. So not only is it unjustified, it's just sort of inorganic. It just tends to be not the way we do things, right? So induction's out. So why is it, and how is it then that we believe that when someone kicks a chair, that kicking has caused the chair to fall over? If it's not through experience, it's not there in the experience. So you don't see cause. You just see a guy kick a chair and the chair fall over. But there's no cause there. At least no cause that you can see. You can't experience it. And it's not through induction. Well, what's left? Well, here Hume's actually already given us the answer. If you remember back to book 3 of the Enquiry, Hume gives us the 3 associations of ideas, right? So remember, the associations of ideas are something like this ability of the mind, this power of the mind to categorize or collate impressions with ideas along certain lines, right? So that's sort of, as it were, make our lives a lot easier so that we can go on. We don't have to make very, very basic inferences that have to sort of spend most of our life making these very basic inferences, but rather we can go on and build civilization, write poetry and philosophy, make movies and babies and cars and all this sort of stuff, right? And remember, what were the 3 associations? There was resemblance, there was contiguity of time and place, or space and time, and then the third one was cause and effect, right? So to answer the question, where is it that we come to believe or accept causal principles? Well, Hume's already told us. He's answered his own question. The question that he poses in book 4, he's already answered in book 3. Why is it that when I see somebody kick a chair and the chair fall over, I immediately think that kick was causally related to the falling over of the chair? It's not because I've seen it, because I can't see cause, and it's not because I've tried to infer it through induction, both because generally that's just not the way we work, but also because that inference would be unjustified anyway. Why is it? It's because the mind which is nice. My Minnesota Twins hat has an M there. It's like I'm pointing to an M for mind. The mind is imputing it already. It's one of the associations of ideas. The mind is saying, Hume thinks, look, this is one of those events where A happens, then B follows, and it doesn't seem to be a mistake. It doesn't seem to be a completely arbitrary or capricious coincidence. Rather, it seems that there's something about kicking a chair whereby we ought to anticipate that the chair will fall over. So I'm going to mind, as it were, is going to associate those two things very closely, so closely, in fact, that we come to anticipate it. The mind is going to, it's like tickling you. It's giving you the feels. It's saying, look, you need to expect that as soon as his leg hits that chair, it's going to topple over. You should come to expect that. It's really useful for you. It's good information for you to come to expect that when people kick things, generally they are affected by that kick, right? So for Hume, we come to this belief not through experience as such, not through seeing the cause, not through logical inference. Rather, we come to expect that the chair will fall over as a result of being kicked. That is to say, it's caused to move or fall over because the mind along this is associating this experience with all past experiences along causal lines. So for Hume, cause and effect is a mental reality, right? It's not something that we find out there in the world. It's something the mind is imputing upon the world, right? It's kind of an interesting point. So one way that lots of people read Hume, and they read it because he uses this terminology, so it's not as though they're being lazy or anything, is that they often read Hume as being skeptical of causal relations. And it's not a terribly important point, but I think it's somewhat important to point out that, technically speaking, I don't think that's correct. Hume is not skeptical about causation. That is to say, Hume doesn't suggest, well, we can't say whether causation is real. Like, that would be the skeptical position, is to say, well, I can't say whether it's true or false, right? There's either a good reason for both or no real reason for either. So I'm sort of going to remain skeptical, sort of agnostic, something like that. Hume's not saying that. Hume actually seems to pretty clearly make the claim that he knows what cause and effect is, or at least where it comes from. It's not where we think. We tend to think that causal relations happen out there in the world, that feet cause things to fall over when they're used to kick them. What Hume wants to suggest is no, cause and effect are mental, it's a part of our mental architecture, our mental apparatus that collates certain events, impressions, with ideas in certain ways. It groups them together. It associates them. So he's not a skeptic about it. He thinks he knows the answer to the question, what is cause and effect, or why is it that we believe in causal relations? The answer is because our mind makes us believe these things. Our mind is set up in such a way that it gives us an imperative to believe that where there is A, B will follow. Right? So in this regard, he's answered the question, not in a skeptical way, not by saying, I can't say one way or the other. He has given an answer. It's just not the answer we generally think. It's not what we generally think cause and effect are. So in this way, I think Hume is not a skeptic about cause and effect. He's what we would call an anti-realist. That is to say, he thinks that cause and effect is a thing. It's something that we can explain. It's something we don't have to remain skeptical or agnostic about. It's just not something that we generally think it is, and more point, it's not something that exists out there in the world, independent of our mind. It's fundamentally something, or at least primarily, it's a mental reality. It's the mind's imputing beliefs or anticipations upon the world. That is, we see something and our mind says, look, watch this. There's A, B's going to happen. You should expect B to happen. Right? And we believe that so strongly that we naturally see B happen. We go, of course it happened, because there's something, of course these two events are related in a meaningful and not arbitrary way, right? But that is, that's not to say that then there must be something out there causing the two events to be related. In that way, Hume's going to be skeptical. Maybe, I suppose, it's possible that the reason the mind associates along these lines is because there's something actually out there that the mind is picking up. We have no way of knowing that. So in that way, he's a skeptic. He's skeptical about whether we can know that the causal relations exist out there outside of the mind. But he's not skeptical about whether causal relations exist or have as their foundation something in the mind. There, his answer is pretty clear. Yes, we come to believe that X causes Y, A causes B, because the mind forces us, more or less, to believe that, because it's associating impressions and ideas in this way. Okay, so this is, we're going to, one little bit more, and then we're going to finish up here. So we've got, on the one hand, sort of a prosaic, kind of interesting fact about induction. It's unjustifiable because it's founded on question-begging premises. Then we move to kind of an interesting, oh yeah, I guess, when I see X cause Y, or when I believe anyway that X causes Y, maybe it's not, I don't believe that based off of experience, and I certainly don't believe it based off of logical inference. So I can't really know whether X causes Y out there in the world in a mind-independent way. I can only know more or less that my mind wants me to believe that, but I can't really say if that's because it's that way out in the external world. So it turns out we can't really know whether X causes Y outside the mind. So far, these are, sort of abstract, maybe interesting to philosopher-type questions. But Hume then goes to quite a large jump, and he thinks that this implies that we can't know whether the world outside of the mind exists at all. That is, the external world. How the heck does he make that leap, right? So far, we've been talking about sort of prosaic, or esoteric, philosophical arguments, and now all of a sudden we're going to go from them to making a really strong claim like, oh, by the way, that means we can't know whether you're actually sitting at a computer right now actually hearing my voice. Okay, how do we get there? Well, think of the nature of impressions, right? When you have an impression or an experience, you hear somebody's voice in the other room. Maybe someone's watching television. You hear him or her laugh, or you hear music playing in the other room. Maybe someone's got the radio on, or they've got their phone hooked up to a speaker and they're blaring their music or something. So in other words, you've got these impressions. You're hearing something in the other room. Now, where do you think, why is it that as soon as someone turns music on, hi, sweetie, here she is again. Eleanor, can you, I'm almost done, okay? Can you shut the door? Thanks, baby girl. Sorry about that. Dang it, I should, next time I'll lock the door, so we'll make sure this doesn't happen again. Anyway, so why is it that as soon as music starts playing, you immediately, you don't even think about it. What do you think is happening, right? It's not this grand mystery like, whoa, there's this music all of a sudden that's popped up in the air and it kind of sounds like it's coming from this direction somewhere over there. What the heck, right? Let's go investigate this to figure out the cause or the source of this very strange phenomenon, right? You just naturally think, my wife is playing music in the other room. My roommate's playing music in the other room, right? In other words, why is it that I have an experience of hearing music being played? Well, because there's someone over there in the other room who's got music going, and that music is like leaving the speakers in the form of sound waves, and right, those sound waves like enter my ear, and then they're translated by the various mechanisms of the ear and the mind into a sound, into an experience of a certain sort, right? In other words, when you hear, say, music, you believe that there's something causing that experience, right? When you have an experience of any sort, why is it that you believe that you're hearing my voice right now? Why is it that you believe that you see somebody who's got kind of a pathetic beard, someone who's barely tall enough to like be here on the camera, right? Why is it that you believe that you're sitting in front of a computer screen right now? Well, because you have all of these experiences, and you, without even thinking about it, naturally think that these experiences are coming from somewhere outside of your mind. That is to say, you think they're caused by something. You see me because you believe I'm sitting in front of a camera, and then you're sitting in front of a computer screen, and then that camera is recording me, and that it's popping up on your screen, and it's going into your eyes, and your mind is interpreting it, and that sort of thing, and developing for you an experience to help you make sense of everything that's going on. Another way of saying it is because your screen is causing you to believe that, right? So how do we get to Hume's skepticism or anti-realism about the external world? Because it turns out we only believe that the external world exists. Not only, how else would you believe it? But we believe the external world exists because we believe we have experiences of it. Duh. That's just obvious, of course. That's how anyone would defend belief in the external world, because I am experiencing it. Because this table is here in my hands right now. It's not in my mind, right? We believe the external world exists because we experience it. And we believe that experiences justify that belief because experiences are caused by things in the external world. When I see something, it's because there's something there to be seen, and its presence is causing me to see it. And because Hume has isolated this problem with causation as such, this is where we get into his skepticism or anti-realism. How can I trust that just because I have an impression of something means... How can I justify the claim, oh, well, that means because I'm seeing this, I believe that it's out there to be seen and it's causing me to have this impression. How do I justify that inference, right? How do I justify that belief? I can't justify it through a causal structure, right? Because we've got the problem with causation, right? Causation, I don't see the causation in the experience itself. In other words, you don't see not only my face, my shirt. You don't just hear my voice, but it's not as though you've also got cause somewhere flipping it in there. Remember, think of the guy kicking the chair, right? There's no cause to be experienced, and you can't infer it without question begging. So you can't trust whether the things in the external world are causing the experiences you're having, because you have no foundation for trusting that causation itself is veridical. That is to say that it's something that exists outside of the mind. We know that it exists in the mind. Hume thinks we've established that as one of the associations of ideas. But we can't say whether it's happening outside the mind, whether there are in fact things out there causing the impressions that we have in here, that is to say, in the mind. So what seems to be sort of interesting, maybe kind of barely interesting or uninteresting or esoteric philosophical arguments regarding induction and, oh, wow, cause and effect, maybe we can't do anything about that, maybe we can't actually justify that or come to no causal relations. Well, it turns out that if Hume's right about that, we have to remain skeptical about the existence of the external world as a whole, right? Because we only come to believe about the external world because we believe things out there stand in causal relationship. That is, things out there cause us to have experiences of them. And if we can't justify that causal inference, then we can't justify the claim that I believe I'm sitting in front of a computer because it seems that I'm sitting in front of a computer. That is because I'm having the experience of sitting in front of a computer. I can't justify from that experience to the belief because I can't justify that causal relationship, right? So this is where we get what's historically called Humean skepticism, right? Now what we're going to see in book 5 is that even though Hume thinks all these things, he thinks he's argued for this sort of skepticism, he's going to fundamentally say, yeah, but so what, basically, right? I mean, he's going to say, look, yeah, so if I'm right, we can't know these things. We can't know whether the external world exists, but so what? Right? So book 5 is going to be his attempt to suggest to you why it shouldn't really matter anyway, right? And so next week, we'll get to that. This week, just sort of chew over the argument, see whether you think it works. If so, maybe actually if so, not why, because if you think it works, it's probably, you can just rehearse Hume's arguments. But I suspect that most people actually tend to think, no, somewhere Hume's made a mistake. Most people are not convinced Humeans upon reading Hume. So it's interesting to think, to try to chew on and think through, if you're unconvinced by Hume's argument, where has he gone wrong? Because he, maybe he's wrong. Maybe he's made mistakes in the logic. But the argument itself seems to be, if anything, consistent and fairly rigorous, right? He starts with this problem of induction, then points out from that, and from the nature of experience as such, problems with belief and causation, and then from that, problems with belief in the external world arising from experiences. So if you find yourself disagreeing with Hume's conclusions, it's an interesting question. Where does Hume go wrong, right? Because you've got to think he's gone wrong somewhere, because the argument seems to flow pretty tightly. Now we're going to see, I mean, Kant doesn't think Hume is correct. Thomas Reid certainly doesn't think Hume is correct. So there are people that think Hume has made mistakes. But before we get to them, it's interesting for you to maybe chew over why you think if Hume is wrong, where he's wrong. And it can't just be something like, well, because I just think it's obvious that the external world exists. Because we're going to see, certainly by next week in Book 5, obviously Hume, I mean, you don't even have to wait till that long. It should just be clear to you that Hume thinks, obviously, we just believe the external world exists. We're compelled to accept that belief. So he's aware of that. So that's not a terrific objection to his position. Okay, well, this moved pretty quickly. It's quite a bit of information. So yeah, let me know if you got any questions, or this is now online in perpetuity. So, you know, you'll be able to watch us often as you like. Okay, guys, have a good week.